Dawn broke lazily over the heart of the Mbala Reserve. The sky, still painted in deep blue, began to give way to the golden light spilling through the thorny treetops. Ranger Elijah walked slowly along the dusty trail, his eyes scanning the rolling horizon of the savannah with practiced care. There was a calm in the air, but not in his chest. Elijah was a man shaped by time. His sun-weathered face carried the memory of every cycle of nature he had witnessed, rains that gave life, droughts that took it away, births blooming through thorns, and death prowling with yellow eyes in the shadows. For 30 years, he had protected this land. But something about this morning felt different. Like the silence of a drum just before a storm. Crossing a clearing, he stopped on instinct. The tall grass ahead was shifting in an unusual way. Elijah crouched down, his senses on high alert. The wind carried a bittersweet scent of dried blood mixed with something sharper, something foul. His heart quickened. A wounded predator? A forgotten carcass? Or something worse? He stepped forward cautiously, circling around a tangle of thorns. And then he saw it. In the space between shadows and the rising sun, a towering figure stood unsteadily. A lion. A full-grown male, but unlike any Elijah had ever seen. Emaciated to the point where every rib showed, his side sunken, his mane matted and dirty like a forgotten crown. But it was his eyes that struck Elijah most, clouded, yet alive. There was pain in them. And something else. Something ancient. For a moment, Elijah froze, not out of fear, but reverence. Before him stood not just a wild animal, but a living legend on the edge of vanishing. The lion didn't growl. He didn't move. He simply watched, as if recognizing an equal in the man before him. And Elijah, though he didn't know why, understood. This was a call. And he couldn't walk away. The sun was already blazing high in the sky, casting the savannah in hues of orange and gold, as Elijah approached with careful steps. The ground beneath his boots was hot and dry, and the silence surrounding him was thick, so dense it felt like the very breath of nature was being held. Ahead, the lion remained still. His body was a tapestry of scars, ancient marks from battles lost and a stubborn will to survive. Dust clung to his muzzle, and his half-closed eyes barely registered the world around him. Each breath came with effort, his sides rising slowly, as if every movement cost more than he had left to give. But something about the way the lion watched him unsettled Elijah. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. The lion took a hesitant step forward, and Elijah instinctively held his breath. But there was no attack. Just one more faltering movement, then collapse. The lion fell onto his side, panting heavily, as if the weight of his own existence had finally brought him down. Elijah crept closer, step by step. At just a few meters away, the stench of death mixed with the heat of the sun and the sharp scent of open wounds. Only then did he see clearly, parasites wriggling beneath the skin, tiny white larvae burrowed deep into raw flesh, as though the earth itself had begun to reclaim him. Then the lion's eyes opened once more, locking with Elijah's. And in that moment, there were no barriers between man and beast, only two survivors of the wild, both worn by time, both carrying too many stories in their bones. A chill ran down Elijah's spine. This lion wasn't just a sick animal. He was a dethroned king, a fallen monarch marching toward the end with the silent dignity of the great ones. And he wasn't there by chance. In that space between the ranger and the beast, an unspoken bond was forged. A silent promise. Elijah knew then, he couldn't leave him there. Barudi, the name would come to him later, whispered like wind through the grass. And nothing in his life would make sense after that encounter. Elijah knew he was breaking protocol. Rangers weren't allowed to interfere directly with wild animals, especially not dangerous predators like lions. But in the face of what he saw, the rulebook felt like a meaningless sheet of paper, far removed from the raw reality of the savannah. With trembling hands, he returned to his jeep and grabbed a piece of meat he had set aside for the patrol dogs. As he came back, he stayed at a safe distance. He placed the meat on the ground, halfway between himself and the lion. Baruti didn't move. He simply watched, as if waiting for something more than food. Minutes passed in silence. Then, with visible effort, Baruti dragged his frail body toward the meat. His jaws opened slowly, teeth sinking into the flesh with a blend of hunger and exhaustion. It was instinct, but also a choice. A choice to trust. As the lion ate, Elijah stepped a little closer, assessing the damage. And the horror revealed itself in layers. The lion's skin was riddled with engorged ticks, clusters of them buried under his ears and in the folds of his neck. But the worst were the open wounds, crawling with white larvae, alive, feeding, chewing through raw flesh. Flies hovered constantly, landing without shame on Baruti's nose, his eyes, indifferent to his pain. Then Elijah saw it, an old scar, thick and raised, stretched across Baruti's left shoulder. A clean puncture wound, the kind only a bullet could leave. Poachers. That scar was a death sentence, not from the shot itself, but from everything that came after. Isolation. Exile. Starvation. Parasites. Elijah radioed the reserve's veterinary team. His voice wavered, but his resolve didn't. While waiting, he soaked a cloth and filled a bowl with fresh water, placing it within the lion's reach. Baruti lifted his head and drank slowly, each drop like a thread of life pulling him back from the brink. When the team arrived, led by Dr. Anika, the head veterinarian, they exchanged solemn glances as they took in the lion's condition. No words were needed. Elijah had done the right thing. Baruti was sedated gently. As the vets began emergency treatment, Elijah stood nearby, unmoving. His heart beat unevenly, as if something within him had also been changed forever. In that moment, under the blazing sky of the savannah, life and death were locked in a silent battle. And Elijah, a weary old ranger, had chosen a side. The side of hope. At the reserve's rehabilitation center, the air felt different. It carried the sterile scent of antiseptic, mixed with faint hope and freshly cleaned wounds. The atmosphere was calm, yet charged with anticipation, as if everyone walked on tiptoe around the thin border between life and death. Baruti slept under the effects of anesthesia, wrapped in thin blankets, his frail body shielded from the night breeze. Beside his stall, Elijah stood with arms crossed, a quiet sentinel. The lion had been stabilized, the larvae removed, the wounds cleaned. But the road ahead was still long. Day after day, Elijah returned. He would sit for hours beside the enclosure in silence, softly reading aloud, murmuring old songs his grandmother once sang to him as a boy. Slowly, Baruti's eyes stopped drifting into the void and began resting on Elijah. First with wariness. Then, familiarity. And eventually, with something Elijah couldn't name, but deeply felt. It was on a dusty afternoon, sunlight streaming in gold through the slats of the infirmary wall, that Elijah whispered the name, Baruti. It meant the one who teaches. And in that moment, as if he understood the word, or maybe just the meaning behind it, the lion slowly lifted his head. Elijah never told anyone why he chose that name. But he knew. Baruti was teaching him to see with different eyes. To stop measuring strength by muscle, or royalty by roar. Sometimes, the greatest dignity is in enduring, in breathing still, even when everything around you tries to make you disappear. That very night, as the cool savannah breeze settled in, Elijah made a promise. In silence, his palm pressed against the glass of Baruti's enclosure, he vowed to bring him home. Back to the land where he was born. Not as a ghost, but as what he truly was, a king. And in that silent exchange between man and beast, something invisible took root. Baruti was no longer alone. And neither was Elijah. days turned into weeks. And even under the care of a dedicated team, Baruti's recovery was slow, stubborn, painful. The antibiotics fought off infection, the medicated baths eased the parasites, but the deepest wound remained unseen. He didn't roar. He didn't walk with pride. His eyes still looked hollow, like windows staring into a past Elijah couldn't reach. But Elijah didn't give up. He began bringing a small hand drum with him, the kind his grandfather used to play during ceremonies. And in the soft light of morning, or under the golden glow of dusk, he would tap out slow rhythms, singing old songs of kings and spirits, of hunters and shadows. At first, Baruti lay still, unmoved. But then, one day, to the sound of an ancient melody, his ear twitched. A few days later, he lifted his head. Weeks later, he stepped closer to the edge of the enclosure. That was the day Elijah cried, for the first time since the rescue. Little by little, Baruti began to walk. First in tight circles. Then longer steps. And when a caretaker approached with fresh meat, the lion stood without hesitation, his muscles still weak, but his dignity slowly returning. Yet there was something Elijah couldn't fully grasp. How had this lion, wounded, shot, abandoned, survived so long on his own? Where had he wandered? Who had hurt him? Why was he still alive, when so many others would have already given in? It was as if Baruti carried with him some ancient pact, something beyond instinct. Something that had kept him standing when everything else said he should fall. Elijah, though no stranger to the mysteries of the savannah, knew that not everything could be explained. Some creatures simply refused to die. And Baruti was one of those souls. A lion who had survived his own extinction, and who now, slowly, was learning to live again.
What do you think of the story so far? It's important that you like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.
Months had passed, and Baruti's transformation was undeniable. The frail, trembling creature who once struggled to lift his head now walked with strength and purpose. His muscles had returned beneath golden fur, and his thick mane flowed in the wind like a crown reborn. At the rehabilitation center, caretakers would often stop just to watch him. What had returned wasn't just physical strength, it was presence. Baruti was no longer a patient. He was a force. A king. Elijah had watched every step of that metamorphosis with quiet eyes and a heavy heart. He felt pride, yes, but also a growing ache, a quiet anxiety. The moment was coming. The return to the savannah. The goodbye. That morning, the sky was clear as glass, and the air carried the quiet electricity of big decisions. The jeep rolled to a stop a few miles from the heart of the reserve, in a wide plain where young lionesses had recently been spotted, untouched territory, ideal for a new beginning. The transport cage opened slowly. Elijah stood nearby, fists clenched at his sides, eyes locked on Baruti. But the lion didn't bolt. He didn't roar. He didn't leap. He simply walked. Step by step, calm and steady, placing his paws on the warm earth like a king returning from exile. The wind stirred the tall grass. Birds fell silent for a moment, as if in reverence. When he was just a few paces from the vast, open land, Baruti stopped. Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes found Elijah's. And in that look, there was no wildness. No fear. Not even the simple gratitude of a rescued animal. There was understanding. For a moment that stretched beyond time, the two remained still, man and beast, bound by something deeper than biology, stronger than logic. An invisible thread forged through time, pain, and the shared will to survive. Then, with one slow blink, Baruti turned and moved on. He disappeared into the savannah, a golden shadow slipping between waves of grass beneath a cloudless sky. Elijah stood there, alone, the wind brushing against his face. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Because he knew, Barudi's roar hadn't vanished. It had simply returned to where it always belonged. Time moved on in the savannah like a river that never stops. Life returned to its unchanging cycle, births, hunts, rains, and droughts. But for Elijah, every patrol now carried a new kind of silence. A new anticipation. Months had passed since Barudi's release. And still, his presence lingered on the land like the invisible heat before a storm. It wasn't something seen, it was something felt. The rumors began quietly, like whispers through the brush. A lone lion had been spotted watching over villages to the north. He didn't attack livestock. He didn't approach the homes. He simply observed, like a guardian. Herders spoke of footsteps in the night, and when they ventured out, they found deep paw prints in the dirt, always leading away, never toward the children or the pens. Women said their dogs barked into the dark, only to fall silent, as if they recognized what stood beyond the shadows. To the south of the reserve, the trails of younger predators began to vanish mysteriously. A few carcasses were found, untouched, not eaten. A warning? A boundary drawn? The rangers called it coincidence. But Elijah called it a sign. And then came the stories. Elders began to speak of the lion without a pride, the solitary spirit roaming the edges of the savannah, restoring balance where there had been chaos. Some said he was a ghost. Others, an ancestral spirit reborn. One child pointed at an ancient cave painting and said she had dreamed of him, amber eyes, a scar on his shoulder, a mane like sunset fire. Elijah said nothing. He just listened. Because deep down, he knew. Barudi was out there. He could feel it in the way the wind shifted at dusk. In the odd hush between the jackal's howls. In the deep pawprints found where no trail should be. In golden eyes that, sometimes, shimmered in the tall grass, only to vanish like a mirage. Elijah felt it when Barudi was near. Like a distant drumbeat echoing in his chest. A bond that needed no words, no closeness. It was ancient. It was primal. Barudi had returned to the savannah. But not as before. Now, he wasn't just a lion. He was a living legend. A king without a throne, ruling over a vast territory of silence and respect. And Elijah, too old now for fairy tales, allowed himself to believe. That sometimes, when the world forgets what nobility looks like, nature sends a reminder. A silent roar that echoes not through the ears, but through the soul. It was the end of the dry season when Elijah climbed the hill of black rocks at the center of the reserve. The wind blew warm, carrying the scent of cracked earth, brittle leaves, and life holding its breath for the first rain. His steps were slow, not from exhaustion, but from reverence. Up there, where half of Mbala could be seen, was a place the elders called the spine of the earth, where the ancients believed animal spirits met with their ancestors. And it was there, beneath the shimmering heat of the horizon, that Elijah saw them. A small group moved in the long shadows of a lone acacia. 2 adult lionesses rested beneath its branches, their eyes sharp and watchful. Around them, 3 cubs played, clumsy, bold, bursting with the energy of a world just beginning. Elijah raised his binoculars, and time seemed to stop. One of the cubs, smaller than the others, stumbled toward its mother with a curious gaze and unsure steps. But what made Elijah freeze was the mark on its left shoulder, a dark patch, shaped like destiny's signature. The exact spot where Barudi once carried his scar. It wasn't a mark of pain. It was a mark of origin. The old ranger felt his eyes well up. For a moment, the entire savannah seemed to fall silent, as if even the wind paused to witness that moment. The lineage had continued. The once dying king who had lain on death's edge now left behind heirs who would grow without the weight of suffering. Without the taste of abandonment. And then, as if sensing Elijah's gaze, a shadow appeared behind the acacia. Barudi. Stronger than ever. his mane now golden like the sun igniting the evening sky. His posture calm, but filled with the quiet authority of someone who had known pain, and survived it. He didn't roar. He didn't charge. He simply walked toward the cubs, who bounced around him with joy. One climbed onto his broad back, gently tugging at his ear. Baruti didn't flinch, he simply watched. And then, for the briefest of moments, his eyes turned toward the top of the hill. Elijah knew. The lion had seen him. And in that fleeting exchange, there was no surprise. Only understanding. As if saying, without words, we're at peace. Baruti's bloodline, now free from the scars of the past, would grow wild and free across the endless savanna. And his story, of pain, of survival, of rebirth, would not end there. It would live on in every pawprint of those cubs. In every roar echoing through the valleys. In every shadow gliding beneath the African moonlight. The circle had closed. But the legend was only beginning. On the porch of the central outpost at Mbala Reserve, the sun set for the 1,000th time in Elijah's eyes. The old wood creaked beneath his chair, and the scent of burnt grass mingled with the rich aroma of strong coffee. Young rangers sat around him, quiet, attentive. Some were too new to remember the time when Baruti was just a dying shadow on the plains. But all of them knew his name. And they knew, his story was never told the same way twice. Elijah, his gaze lost on the horizon, didn't speak of Baruti the way one speaks of an animal. He spoke of him like one might describe an ancient force, something that belonged to the land as much as the wind. He said the lion had been a king long before he ever ruled, because his greatness wasn't in his muscles or his teeth, but in the part of him that endured, even when everything else around him gave in. And he said, with a voice weathered by time, that there's something sacred in those who carry scars, not as wounds, but as maps of where the soul was stitched back to life. The younger ones listened with wide eyes. Others looked away, moved too deeply to meet the old ranger's gaze without something shifting inside them. Because deep down, they all understood, the world needs stories like that. Stories that remind us that not all pain is the end. That sometimes, the final roar is what begins a new era. Out on the savannah, the land breathed. And in the distance, faint, like a whisper carried on the warm wind, Elijah swore he heard a roar echoing. Deep. Ancient. Alive. It was the sound of Baruti. Or maybe just the memory of him. It didn't matter. Because some roars never die. In the golden vastness of the savannah, where winds whisper secrets through the acacia trees and the footsteps of elephants shape the clay paths, there's something that cannot be measured by binoculars or maps. Something that lives between the leaves that dance and the silence that speaks louder than 1,000 voices. There, where time is older than any clock, the story of a lion named Baruti still pulses. Not just in the pawprints that fade with the sunset, nor in the bright eyes of the cubs playing beneath the scarlet sky. But in every soul that learned, through him, that even kings fall, and even the fallen, can rise again. Elijah learned that. And he taught it. And one day, when his journey comes to an end, the savannah will still sing the name Baruti. Because he wasn't just a rescued lion. He became a symbol of what's possible when someone chooses not to give up. In the end, perhaps that's what truly ties us to this earth, the courage to believe, even when strength fades. To care, even when the world says it's hopeless. To love, even when the one you love bears claws and scars. Baruti taught that. Elijah lived that. And now, this story echoes, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Because where there is compassion, there will always be new beginnings. And where a roar was once heard, there will always be something worth remembering.
What an exciting journey, right? If you liked it, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to hear more amazing stories like this.